If you stood at the edge of the western plains just as dawn broke, you might mistake the ranch for a painting. Distant hills rising blue and soft, fences disappearing into golden fields. The sky so wide it made you feel both free and small. That's how it always seemed to Samuel, standing on the porch with his coffee cooling in his hand, watching the world wake up. But inside the small house behind him, there was a silence much deeper than the morning calm. June, his 6-year-old daughter, sat cross-legged on the sun-bleached wood floor, tracing circles in the dust with one finger. She hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. Sometimes, when the world was quietest, Samuel tried to remember the sound of her voice, high and sweet and bubbling over with laughter, like water running over stones. Now, there was only her breathing, slow and steady, and the soft rustle of her dress as she moved, a world of silence so complete. It sometimes hurt to look at her. Samuel couldn't help it. He worried constantly. He told himself not to hover, but he watched her out of the corner of his eye as he moved around the kitchen, setting bread on a plate, pouring milk, trying to tempt her with something she liked. She rarely looked up. Her eyes, big and deep and so much like her mother's, were usually fixed somewhere far away, someplace he couldn't reach, no matter how hard he tried. He kept a photograph of his late wife on the mantel, framed in old silver, polished smooth from years of gentle touch. She's just like her mother, so quiet, he found himself saying, as if it was both a comfort and a curse. Sometimes at night, he would sit alone at the table running a finger around the rim of his coffee mug and wonder if grief had swallowed them both whole. The ranch was home, yes, but it was also a kind of prison, a place where memories echoed louder than words. June didn't laugh. She didn't run to him with scraped knees or wild stories like other children. She didn't want hugs, didn't cry out for him in the dark. She never looked him in the eyes. It was as if she had built a world inside herself, a place he could never enter, no matter how hard he knocked. But even in her silence, Samuel could feel her pain, a kind of raw, invisible wound. He watched the way she flinched at loud noises, or how she curled her fingers tight when strangers came near. Every sound seemed to crash too loud, every touch too sudden. Sometimes he found her pressed up against the window glass, watching the horizon for hours, eyes tracking things he couldn't see. Neighbors whispered. The grocery store clerk asked questions he hated to answer. "She's shy, huh? She'll grow out of it. You should try this therapy, that school." Every suggestion was like a pebble in his shoe, tiny, persistent, impossible to ignore. But none of them understood the truth. He wasn't just fighting for his daughter. He was fighting for a piece of himself, too. If he lost her to that silent world, what was left of the family they once had? He tried every day to reach her. He learned to wait out her silences, to read her small gestures, a nod, a tilt of her head, the way she turned her body toward him when she wanted something. He learned not to force eye contact, not to touch her without warning. Patience became a daily practice, like mending a fence or feeding the chickens. But no matter how much love he poured into her, she stayed locked inside herself. There were good days, of course, days when the sun shone just right, when the wind was gentle and the world felt possible. On those days, June would wander outside and sit in the tall grass behind the barn, face tilted up to the sky, arms wrapped tight around her knees. Samuel watched from a distance, always, and wondered what she saw out there that he couldn't. Other days, the weight of the silence nearly crushed him. He'd see other children at church, running wild and shouting, and the ache would twist in his chest. He'd remember the feel of his wife's hand in his, the way she used to sing to June, and wonder how much more the two of them could lose before there was nothing left. It wasn't just the absence of words. It was the absence of laughter, of shared stories, of all the small, ordinary things that made a home feel alive. Even the animals on the ranch seemed to notice, moving quieter around June, watching her with the same wary gentleness Samuel tried to muster. Sometimes, late at night, he'd stand in June's doorway, watching her sleep. She looked peaceful then, one hand curled under her chin, lips parted in a silent dream. He'd whisper, "Good night, baby," hoping maybe somehow she could hear him, hoping that somewhere in that quiet world of hers, she still remembered how much she was loved. But morning always came, and with it, the unbroken silence. A challenge, a question, a hope he refused to let die. Out there, on the sunlit, dusty ranch, father and daughter lived side by side, grieving, hoping, waiting for something to change. And somewhere beyond the fences, past the edge of the fields, the wild world moved on, full of secrets and possibilities. Neither of them could know it yet, but that world was about to send them a sign, one that would break the silence and change everything. The day began with a chill that crept in under the doors and sent Samuel out early, boots crunching on frost-laced dirt, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. Morning always brought a string of chores: feeding chickens, fixing the fence where the wind had rattled loose a plank, checking the water troughs. But that morning, as the first gold light slanted over the barn, something felt off. He heard it first, a scatter of agitated clucks and the frantic fluttering of wings from the old chicken coop behind the house. Samuel's heart jumped. Coyotes were not uncommon out here, and raccoons had made a mess more than once. But as he hurried around the corner, what he saw in the dirt stopped him cold. Tracks, clear, unmistakable, and not like any he'd seen so close to the house before. They were bobcat tracks, pressed deep and wide in the soft earth, with a strange, uneven drag as if the animal was limping. One paw print lagged behind the others, the claws scoring deep grooves into the dirt. Samuel's mind raced. A wounded bobcat this close to the chickens was bad news. It meant desperation, hunger, or something worse. He knelt down, running a finger along the fresh track. It was still damp, barely crusted with last night's dew. He stood, eyes narrowing, scanning the tree line that circled the edge of the property. The tracks led away from the coop, not toward it. Strange. He followed them a few yards before they veered off, straight for the far hill, vanishing where the sun cut sharp against the horizon. He didn't notice June at first, small and silent as a shadow in the window. But there she was, forehead pressed against the glass, hands braced on the sill. Her gaze wasn't on him, or the chickens, or even the tracks. She was locked onto that distant hill with a focus Samuel had rarely seen in her. He paused, surprised by the intensity on her face. Her lips were parted, eyes narrowed, breathing slow and deep, almost as if she could see something out there he could not. For a moment, a wild hope flickered through Samuel. Was she reacting to the tracks? Did she sense the danger, the mystery, the call of something out there in the wild? He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, his mind already turning over what to do. The rational part of him thought, trap it. Protect the chickens, keep June safe. Do what any rancher would do. But there was something in his daughter's expression, so urgent, so alive, that made him pause. June never looked at him, but she didn't look away from the hill either. Her eyes, usually distant or unfocused, were now filled with a quiet, electric energy. For the first time in years, Samuel saw a spark of purpose, a silent call answered by something only she could feel. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, the familiar weight of worry pressing on his shoulders. "Did you see something, honey?" he asked, soft and careful, not expecting an answer. But June didn't move, didn't blink. The morning sun painted a halo around her hair as she stared out into the wild, utterly still. Samuel moved around her, glancing out the window himself. All he saw were shadows lengthening across the grass, a hawk circling overhead, the brush rippling in the breeze. But June was locked onto that spot, her entire body tense, as if she were listening for a voice that spoke only to her. He crouched beside her, careful not to touch. "You're safe," he murmured, more for himself than for her. But he followed her gaze, searching for whatever had caught her attention. The world felt suddenly sharper, every sound amplified. The drip of the kitchen sink, the distant lowing of a cow, the heartbeat thump of his own anxiety. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, just beyond his reach. Later, as he cleaned out the coop and scattered feed, Samuel kept glancing back at the house, watching June in the window. The chickens pecked nervously, feathers still ruffled from their nighttime visitor. He set his jaw. Maybe it was just a wild animal, a wounded predator driven by hunger. Maybe it would move on. But the ranch had lost enough. He wasn't about to let anything threaten what was left of his family. He considered his options, setting a steel trap near the coop, alerting the sheriff, borrowing the neighbor's hounds. But each idea felt heavy, wrong somehow. He couldn't explain it, but June's silent intensity haunted him. What if the bobcat wasn't a threat, but a sign? What if it meant something only his daughter understood? The day stretched on. June didn't leave the window. She watched as Samuel checked the fence line, as he circled the barn, as he walked the property's edge again and again, searching for more tracks. He felt her eyes on him, a silent connection stretching between them like a thread, fragile but real. When night came, the sky exploded in stars, cold and clear. Samuel lay awake long after June was tucked into bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of her focused face burned into his mind. In the deep hours, when even the wind fell silent, he imagined her voice calling out to the wild, calling to the bobcat, to her mother, to anyone who could bridge the chasm of their shared silence. And out there, somewhere past the reach of the porch light, a wounded creature limped through the grass, leaving tracks that would change everything. The ranch had its own quiet rhythms, and by late afternoon, the sun washed everything in gold, casting long, drowsy shadows from the barn and fence posts. June often spent these hours outdoors, and Samuel had come to respect her boundaries, letting her wander within sight but never pressing too close. It was a strange sort of dance they did, her drifting, him hovering, both searching for comfort in the familiar shapes of home. Behind the house, an ancient oak tree spread its thick arms across a patch of wild grass and scattered bluebells. Samuel's wife used to call it the family's listening tree. She believed the tree was old enough to remember every secret ever whispered beneath its branches, every sorrow and every hope. June had taken to sitting beneath that tree almost every day now, her small back pressed to the rough bark, legs folded beneath her. head tilted to the side as if she were listening too. On this particular afternoon, Samuel found himself watching her from the kitchen window, caught between worry and wonder. June hadn't spoken, but her eyes seemed brighter, her focus sharper than he'd seen in years. He wondered if she was tracing the memory of those wild tracks, or if something deeper stirred in her heart. He wished, selfishly sometimes, that she would let him in. A soft breeze stirred the grass, and a pair of mourning doves cooed low in the branches above. Samuel noticed, with a sudden pang, that June's body was utterly still. Not the fidgeting, anxious stillness he'd learned to recognize, but a deep, meditative calm. She looked for all the world as if she belonged to that moment, as if the entire landscape had hushed itself to keep from disturbing her. He poured himself a mug of coffee and settled into the porch chair, resolving to simply watch. And that's when he saw movement at the edge of the clearing, so small, so subtle, he almost missed it. Something low to the ground, slipping through the shadows with a hunter's caution. It was the bobcat. Samuel's first instinct was to jump up, to shout, to scare it off. But something about the way June didn't move, didn't flinch or turn her head, made him pause. The bobcat was smaller than he'd imagined, its mottled coat blending perfectly with the scrub and shadows. As it crept closer, he could see the awkward angle of its back right leg, the injury making its gait uneven but not powerless. June remained motionless as the bobcat approached. The animal paused, sniffed the air, then settled a cautious distance away from her, close enough that Samuel could see its golden eyes, wide and wary, fixed not on June but on the space between them. A silent understanding seemed to pass, a fragile truce held together by the hush of the afternoon. Samuel's heart hammered. He felt trapped between awe and fear. The urge to intervene pulsed in his chest, but he stayed rooted to his chair, not daring to break the spell. He watched his daughter, small and silent beneath the mighty oak, sitting with a wild animal as if they'd known each other for years. Minutes passed, long, slow, breathless minutes. Then June did something Samuel would never forget. She leaned her head a little closer to the ground, her lips parting, and in a voice so quiet he almost doubted he heard it, she whispered. Not words meant for people, but something softer, smaller, a sound only the bobcat could catch, or maybe the oak, or maybe the wind itself. Samuel froze, gripping his mug so tightly it nearly cracked. He strained to hear, desperate for some sign, some proof that the world had shifted. The bobcat's ears flicked, its body relaxed, just a fraction, as if the whisper had drawn a line of trust across the grass. June stayed there for what felt like an eternity, whispering to the wild cat in that gentle, secret tongue. She never reached out to touch it, never tried to close the distance, but there was an undeniable bond in the air. A bridge spanning the gap between her silent world and the wildness outside. Samuel's eyes burned, and he wiped at them with the back of his hand, his mind reeling. Was this real? Was his daughter, his silent, unreachable June, speaking to a wounded bobcat under their family's listening tree? For a moment, all his fear melted away, replaced by a wonder so fierce it almost hurt. Finally, as the shadows deepened and the evening cool settled in, the bobcat stood, tested its injured leg, and limped back into the brush. June didn't follow. She sat perfectly still, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips, her hands loose and relaxed in her lap. Samuel waited until she finally rose and wandered back to the house, eyes dreamy, the weight she always carried seeming just a little lighter. He didn't say a word, didn't dare break the spell. That night, as he tucked her in, he whispered, "Good night, sweetheart," and was almost certain he saw her lips move in answer, the shape of something unspoken passing through the dark. In bed, Samuel replayed the afternoon again and again, searching for the lesson in what he'd witnessed. He thought of his wife, the way she'd said the tree could listen to secrets, the way June had found a way to bridge worlds, hers and the wild's, without ever saying a word anyone else could hear. Outside, the oak tree stood sentinel in the moonlight, and Samuel found himself hoping, maybe for the first time since his wife passed, that healing could happen in silence, that connection could bloom even when words fell short. He slept lighter that night, the image of June and the bobcat, side by side beneath the old oak, etched deep into his heart. Every morning now, June woke with the sun, padding quietly through the house before Samuel even finished his first cup of coffee. He'd find her at the window or out on the porch, eyes scanning the horizon, body humming with a kind of anticipation he hadn't seen since she was a toddler. There was a lightness to her movements, a sense of expectation that replaced the heavy, drifting silence that had once defined her days. The bobcat returned, always in the gentle hours between dawn and noon, always approaching from the same direction, limping slightly but with a growing confidence. Each day the distance between June and the wild animal seemed to shrink, until finally the two sat in the dappled shade beneath the old oak, face to face. There was no fear in June, no hesitation in her posture, only the steady calm of someone who finally understood their place in the world. From the porch, Samuel watched them. He felt the strangest mix of emotions: pride, awe, worry, even envy. The sight of his daughter, so open and alive in the presence of something wild, filled him with hope and something sharper, an ache that made him question what he'd missed, what walls he'd built around his own heart. He tried not to disturb them, not to intrude. Instead, he took to working quietly nearby, mending the fence or gathering kindling, always keeping one eye on the clearing. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way June's breathing slowed and matched the gentle rise and fall of the bobcat's side. The way her hands moved in small, deliberate gestures, sometimes reaching out, sometimes pulling back. One day, with a softness that nearly undid him, he saw her stretch out two fingers and gently graze the animal's injured leg. The bobcat flinched, but didn't pull away. Instead, it blinked those amber eyes, holding June's gaze with a trust that seemed almost sacred. The first time Samuel saw this, his heart hammered in his chest. The moment was so delicate he was afraid to even breathe. He realized, watching them, that neither June nor the bobcat needed words. Their communication was woven from patience, stillness, and the quiet willingness to simply share space. No expectations, no demands. They listened to each other with their whole selves, a lesson Samuel found both beautiful and painful. He knew he couldn't make sense of it alone, so one afternoon he drove into town to speak with the only therapist he trusted, a woman named Irene who had known his family for years. He told her about June's sudden focus, about the bobcat, about the silent conversations unfolding under the oak tree. Irene listened with a half smile and finally said, "Some children don't need words, just someone willing to sit at their pace." The words sank in deeper than Samuel expected. For so long, he'd been waiting for a miracle, a sign that June would come back to him, that she'd return to the world of laughter and chatter and easy hugs. But maybe, he realized, she'd simply found a different way of being, one he could only begin to understand. He started spending more time near the oak tree, but always at a respectful distance. He watched as June and the bobcat developed a daily ritual. The animal would arrive, wary but determined, and June would greet it with her small, careful movements. Sometimes she'd bring bits of food, a scrap of chicken, a half-eaten biscuit, and place them just far enough away that the bobcat had to choose trust over caution. Always she'd wait, breath slow and steady, until the animal edged closer. There were setbacks, moments when the bobcat startled at a sudden sound or a cloud's shadow passing overhead. But June never forced the connection. She let the wildness set its own boundaries, accepting the pace and rhythm of healing with a patience that left Samuel humbled. Over time, Samuel saw a subtle transformation in June. She was still mostly silent, still kept her world close, but she became more present. She started nodding in response to questions, sometimes meeting his eyes for a fleeting second, sometimes reaching out to touch his sleeve or rest her hand on the kitchen table while he worked. These small gestures, once so rare, became her own language of trust, a language he was finally learning to speak. The ranch itself seemed to respond. The air felt lighter, the evenings less heavy. Samuel found himself humming as he worked, fixing the barn roof or stacking wood with a new sense of purpose. Even the animals noticed, chickens clucking with less nervousness, the old hound stretching in the sun instead of barking at every shadow. One morning, after watching June and the bobcat from afar, Samuel caught himself smiling. He realized he was no longer waiting for words. He was simply grateful for every small connection, every glance, every breath shared beneath the oak tree. As the days passed, the bond between June and the bobcat only deepened. Sometimes, neighbors driving by would slow their trucks, staring in wonder at the wild cat sunning itself beside the silent child. Samuel let them gawk. He understood now that the world didn't need to understand what was happening on his ranch. This was their miracle, unfolding in the quiet space between wildness and home. And for the first time in a long while, Samuel let himself believe in the possibility of healing, not just for June, but for himself as well. Night on the ranch always brought a hush that settled deep into the floorboards and drifted across the fields, blanketing the house in a kind of restless peace. Samuel used to welcome it, finding comfort in routine and the sense that no matter how hard the day had been, at least the world grew still by midnight. But ever since the bobcat began visiting, the silence at night felt different. No longer just the absence of sound, but a reminder of everything Samuel longed for and could not reach. He lay awake more often now, listening to the distant cry of coyotes and the creak of the old house as it settled. His thoughts spun in circles, always returning to June, her silent world, her sudden connection to the wild, the easy way she seemed to speak with that injured bobcat without a single word. It gnawed at him, this new twist of fate. Samuel had spent years fighting to reach his daughter, desperate to pull her from the sea of silence that had swallowed her since his wife died. Yet here was a wild animal, untamed, unpredictable, who crossed the distance with ease, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. One night, unable to sleep, Samuel rose and padded barefoot through the darkened house. He stopped in the living room, drawn by the old photograph of his wife that still stood on the mantel. Her eyes, clear, laughing, eternally young, looked back at him, and for a moment Samuel felt an ache so raw it nearly took his breath away. He reached out and traced her cheek with one calloused finger, voice trembling. "Why can she reach the wild, but not me?" The words hung in the air, thick with longing and defeat. He thought of all the times he'd tried to coax a smile or a word from June, birthday cakes with too many candles, new toys left untouched, Stories read aloud to an audience of one silent child and an empty rocking chair. There was no answer, just the low ticking of the clock and the faint scent of lilac, left over from the days when his wife filled the house with cut flowers. Samuel closed his eyes, letting the memories roll over him. June as a toddler, babbling and giggling, his wife singing as she kneaded bread. The way the three of them once moved through the world together, a small and sturdy family against the wind. Envy was not an emotion Samuel welcomed, but there it was, lurking at the edge of his heart. He envied the bobcat, not for its freedom or wildness, but for the way June seemed to see it, really see it, with a kind of clarity and openness she never offered to him. He wondered if his own grief had blinded him, made him miss the small, quiet signals June sent into the world. Had he spent so much time listening for her voice that he'd forgotten how to truly listen for her heart? He didn't sleep that night, and when morning finally broke, it found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the dew-covered grass, jaw clenched in determination. He knew he couldn't force his way into June's world. Not anymore. If he wanted to reach her, he'd have to learn her language, not drag her back to his. That meant setting aside his own expectations, his own desperate hope for a miracle, and letting June set the pace. From that morning on, Samuel made a quiet vow. He would stop trying to make June talk, stop chasing her with questions and plans and well-meant advice. Instead, he would watch, listen, and learn. He started by joining her outdoors, not as a guardian, but as an observer, keeping his distance when she sat with the bobcat, waiting for her to invite him in, however she chose. He paid closer attention to the little things, how June's body relaxed when she was with the bobcat, how her fingers danced in the air as she watched the animal limp and stretch, how she seemed to breathe easier in the creature's company. Samuel let himself feel the sting of jealousy when he saw the bond between them, but he also let it transform into something else, a kind of respect for the wild, for whatever mystery had chosen his daughter as its friend. Sometimes, in the golden light of late afternoon, Samuel would catch June glancing back at him from under the oak tree. Their eyes would meet, just for a moment. And in that split second, Samuel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't need to bridge the gap all at once. Maybe all he had to do was show up over and over and trust that love could speak without words. One evening, as a storm threatened on the horizon, Samuel found June and the bobcat curled up together beneath the oak, the animal's injured leg stretched toward June's outstretched hand. He didn't interrupt, just watched from the porch as thunder rolled in the distance and wind stirred the grass. He saw the way June traced gentle circles on the bobcat's fur, the way the animal leaned into her touch, eyes closing in trust. For the first time, Samuel didn't feel left out. He felt invited, slowly, quietly, into a world he'd only ever glimpsed from afar. He sat on the porch long after dusk, letting the sound of June's laughterless joy fill the air, feeling for once that he was exactly where he needed to be. That night before bed, Samuel stood in front of his wife's picture and whispered, "I'm learning, Clara. I promise. I'll listen better, even if it takes the rest of my life." He meant every word. And as the storm finally broke and rain lashed the windows, Samuel felt something inside him shift. He no longer feared June's silence. He began, instead, to honor it, trusting that love, like the wild, sometimes needed space to come home. The evening air was thick, heavy with the promise of rain. Far on the horizon, dark thunderheads rolled and gathered, swallowing up the last slanting rays of sunlight. Samuel paused on the porch, feeling the electric tingle in the air, the kind that always made his hair stand on end. He glanced at the old oak tree, its branches swaying against a wind that smelled of earth and coming change. June was out there, sitting in the grass with the bobcat curled nearby, both of them watchful, heads turning in tandem as the sky darkened. Samuel considered calling June in early, but she looked so peaceful, her body relaxed, one hand resting lightly in the grass, the bobcat's head nestled on its paws. Over the past days, their bond had deepened into something close to ritual. Samuel had found comfort in his new role as observer, sometimes moving quietly among his chores, sometimes simply sitting, letting June's calm wash over him. But tonight was different. The wind picked up, scattering loose straw across the yard and rattling the barn doors. Lightning forked above the hills, momentarily painting the world in stark, brilliant white. The air crackled with tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Samuel stood, uncertain, as the first fat drops began to fall. "June," he called gently, not wanting to startle her or the bobcat, but the wind snatched his voice away. June looked up, wide-eyed, hair whipping across her cheeks. The bobcat was already on its feet, tense and alert, ears flat against its skull. Another bolt of lightning split the sky. Thunder followed a heartbeat later, so close it rattled the windows and set the chickens shrieking in their coop. Samuel started toward the oak tree, but June moved faster. In one quick, startled motion, she reached for the bobcat, but the animal slipped away, disappearing into the tall grass with a flash of its striped tail. June stumbled, her hands grasping at empty air, panic twisting her features in a way Samuel hadn't seen since she was small. She turned, searching for the animal, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Then she screamed. The sound tore through the storm, a raw, primal cry, jagged with terror and heartbreak. Samuel froze. In 3 long years, he hadn't heard her voice raised above a whisper. The scream cut through every wall of silence, every layer of grief that had grown between them. For a moment, the world itself seemed to pause. He ran to her, feet slipping in the wet grass, heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. June was spinning in circles, rain plastering her hair to her face, hands clutching at her chest as if she were trying to hold herself together. "June!" Samuel shouted, trying to reach her through the torrent. "It's okay, I'm here." But she didn't seem to hear him. Another peal of thunder crashed overhead, and June bolted, running for the porch, the storm swallowing her up. Samuel caught up just as she reached the steps, her body shaking, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. She turned back to the darkness, hands outstretched. "Don't be scared," she yelled, her voice cracked and desperate, breaking years of silence in one shattering moment. "Don't be scared." Samuel fell to his knees beside her, arms open, not daring to touch. June sobbed, shoulders heaving. For the first time, she looked straight at him, eyes wild with terror and need. In that instant, Samuel understood the storm wasn't just in the sky. It was in June, too, crashing through her, tearing down walls he'd thought were permanent. He didn't speak. He simply knelt beside her, sharing the cold and wet, letting the storm rage around them. Together they watched the yard, searching for any sign of the bobcat. Hoping, fearing, waiting. Samuel wanted to say 1,000 things. "I'm here. I love you. I'm sorry I haven't known how to help." But he held his tongue, knowing that presence meant more than words ever could. The storm intensified, rain slashing sideways, the oak tree bending under the wind's assault. June began to rock, her hands pressed tight over her ears, blocking out the thunder. Samuel wrapped his coat around her shoulders and pulled her close, not forcing, just offering warmth and shelter. After a moment, June let him. She leaned into him, trembling, her sobs quieting into shuddering breaths. Time became a blur. Flashes of lightning, the pounding of rain, the low rumble of thunder echoing off the hills. Samuel lost track of everything except the feeling of his daughter beside him, real and alive, and more present than she had been in years. He murmured soft reassurances, the old words he used to whisper when she was a baby and afraid of the dark. Finally, as the worst of the storm began to pass, June's breath steadied. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, staring out into the night. "Bobcat," she whispered, the word barely audible but clear. Samuel squeezed her gently, heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. "We'll find him," he promised, voice rough with emotion. "We'll find your friend." And in that moment, as the rain slowed and the storm faded into distant grumbles, Samuel realized something fundamental had changed. June had broken through her silence, not for him, not for herself, but for the wild creature she had come to love. Her voice, ragged and new, was a lifeline, a thread thrown into the chaos, anchoring her to the world once more. Inside, the house glowed with lamplight and warmth, but neither Samuel nor June was ready to return to its shelter. They sat together on the porch, watching the storm drift away, sharing the quiet that followed, not the old, empty silence, but a new kind, filled with possibility and hope. Samuel pressed a kiss to June's damp hair. "We'll go out at first light," he said. "Together." For the first time in years, June nodded, her hand finding his, and as the clouds parted and the stars slowly emerged, father and daughter sat side by side, wounded, weathered, and finally, at last, ready to search for what they had both lost and found again in the wild night. The world was a different place after the storm. Rain had washed away the dust and old sorrow, but it left behind a wild uncertainty, a land reshaped by water and wind. Fences leaned askew. The old oak tree dripped and shivered in the gray morning. Puddles reflected the pale light, and everywhere the earth was marked by a tangle of tracks, some sharp and new, others blurred by the downpour. Samuel had barely slept. All night, June had curled against him on the porch, her breaths growing slow and even as exhaustion pulled her under. But when first light crept through the thinning clouds, she was awake in an instant. There was a new urgency in her, a fierce, determined energy that erased every trace of the girl who used to drift silent and aimless through her days. "Let's find him," she whispered, voice raw but steady, as if she'd been waiting years to say it. Samuel nodded, grabbing his coat and boots. He was careful, moving slowly, letting June set the pace. This time, she didn't shrink from his presence. When she slipped her small hand into his heart skipped, hope flaring so bright it almost hurt. For the first time since her mother died, June was reaching for him, not just in need, but in trust. He squeezed her hand, feeling that bond, fragile but real, threading them together. They set out across the yard, boots sinking into mud, air crisp and clean after the rain. June led the way, her eyes scanning every shadow, every broken blade of grass. Samuel kept watch for danger, shotgun slung across his back just in case. But he sensed something had shifted. This wasn't about protection. It was about faith, about listening, about searching together for what mattered most. They found the first sign near the edge of the barn, A muddy paw print, smeared and uneven, the mark of a limp clear in the soft ground. June knelt, tracing the outline with gentle fingers. Samuel crouched beside her, studying the trail. "He's still hurt," he murmured. "He can't be far." June didn't answer, but her eyes glowed with purpose. She pressed her hand flat to the earth, as if feeling for the bobcat's heartbeat, then stood and moved on, scanning the fence line. Samuel followed, matching her pace, letting the morning fill with the quiet music of their footsteps and the distant, hopeful calls of birds. The ranch felt different in the aftermath of the storm. Branches littered the fields. A chicken wire fence had collapsed, the wind having tossed it like a child's toy. The creek that bordered the far pasture ran wild and swollen, carrying bits of debris and snapping at the banks. Samuel noted all these things, but June was relentless, eyes darting, body tense, always searching. They reached the far pasture, where the land sloped gently down to a narrow ditch half filled with rainwater. It was here, beneath the ragged edge of a fallen sycamore, that June froze. She pointed, a sharp, urgent gesture. Samuel squinted into the shadows and felt his breath catch. There, huddled in the muddy hollow, was the bobcat. The animal looked smaller in the daylight, soaked, shivering, flanks heaving with effort. Its injured leg was twisted beneath it, blood dark against tawny fur. Yellow eyes stared up at them, wild but not afraid. For a moment, no one moved. Samuel felt the world narrow to a single point. The battered animal, the silent girl, and himself joined in crisis. June stepped forward, her body language open, her hands low and gentle. "It's okay," she breathed, her voice carrying a softness Samuel had almost forgotten. "We're here. We're here." The bobcat blinked, eyes flicking between June and Samuel. Samuel crouched slowly, setting the shotgun aside, palms open in surrender. "We just want to help," he said quietly, voice trembling. "Let us help you." June knelt beside the bobcat, her movements patient and calm. She touched its fur, fingers light as wind, and the animal shuddered but did not pull away. Samuel swallowed, heart pounding. He reached out, careful, respectful, and the bobcat accepted his presence, allowing him closer than any wild creature ever had. Together, father and daughter worked in the narrow ditch, Samuel gently lifting the wounded animal while June murmured soft, wordless sounds. The bobcat's breath was ragged, body tense, but it did not fight. Samuel felt the weight of trust, heavy and sacred, as he cradled the bobcat in his arms and climbed the slippery bank. June pressed her cheek to the bobcat's wet fur, tears mingling with rainwater, her arms encircling the creature in an embrace that spoke every word she could not say. "You're safe now," she whispered. "You're safe." They carried the bobcat back across the field, June never leaving its side. Samuel marveling at the transformation in his daughter, the courage, the care, the fierce love that radiated from her in every gesture. The storm had torn something open, and in the wreckage, something new and beautiful was taking root. When they reached the house, Samuel set the bobcat gently by the fire, wrapping it in old towels. June knelt beside her friend, eyes never leaving its face, hands trembling but sure. Samuel tended to the wound, cleaning it with warm water, binding it with steady hands. All the while June whispered and soothed, her voice weaving a tapestry of hope and healing. That night, as the fire burned low and the storm faded to memory, Samuel watched his daughter, her face aglow with purpose, her spirit unbroken, and knew that something extraordinary had happened. They had searched in the darkness together, and found not just the lost, wild animal, but the bridge between their hearts. In the hush that followed, Samuel placed his arm gently around June's shoulders, and she leaned into him, her head resting against his side. The house was quiet, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the breath of new beginnings, the silent language of trust, and the promise that, together, they could weather any storm. For 3 days, the world outside seemed to pause. The storm had passed, leaving the ranch in a hush, as if all of nature waited and watched the small miracle taking shape by the wood stove in Samuel's living room. The rain-swept fields glistened under the morning sun, but Samuel barely noticed. His world had shrunk to the circle of lamplight around the fire, to the steady rhythm of June's breath, to the fragile pulse of life in the wounded bobcat's chest. The first night, June refused to leave the bobcat's side. She sat on a folded blanket, cross-legged and vigilant, one hand always resting gently on the animal's flank. The bobcat, wild and trembling, seemed to sense it was safe, at least for now. It lay stretched on a towel, injured leg bandaged, its eyes flickering open and shut as pain and exhaustion took turns claiming it. Samuel busied himself with practical tasks, but his heart was restless. He kept the fire stoked, brought bowls of water, reheated soup, and watched the two of them, his silent daughter and her wild companion, sharing a bond deeper than anything he'd witnessed before. He was careful not to crowd them, keeping his movements slow, his voice low. He'd learned, finally, the value of patience and presence. Sometimes, all you could offer was space and the comfort of simply being there. On the second morning, June woke before sunrise. Samuel found her in the dim light, humming softly, smoothing the bobcat's fur with delicate fingers. The animal flinched at first, but then relaxed, pushing its head into her palm. Samuel felt a strange sense of pride and relief. He had changed the bandage during the night, quietly explaining each step. June had watched, wide-eyed and serious, nodding in silent approval. When he handed her a clean cloth, she'd accepted it, helping him dab at the wound with surprising tenderness. It was the first time in years that they'd truly worked together, a rhythm forming between them, wordless but real. June anticipated what Samuel needed: fresh water, more towels, a careful eye on the bobcat's breathing. She fetched things without being asked, moving with a new confidence, her focus absolute. Samuel, in turn, found himself relying on her, letting her lead when the animal grew agitated, trusting her instincts in a way that felt natural and right. The bobcat's recovery was slow and uneasy. It would sometimes jerk awake, eyes wild, ready to bolt. But June would whisper, her voice like a breeze, and the animal would settle, listening only to her. Samuel marveled at the trust she inspired. It was as if June spoke a language older than words, one woven from stillness and gentleness, from the willingness to wait and listen. For the first time, Samuel allowed himself to imagine a different kind of healing. He realized he'd been measuring June's progress by the wrong yardstick, waiting for speech, for laughter, for the obvious signs of normalcy. But now, watching her nurture the wounded creature, he saw strength and empathy blooming in her, quiet but unbreakable. June wasn't just healing the bobcat. She was finding her own way back to the world, one careful step at a time. As the hours passed, Samuel began to include June more in the care. He let her pour water, hold the animal steady, even spread ointment on the wound under his guidance. She responded with nods, small gestures, the occasional fleeting glance into his eyes. These moments, so tiny, so easy to overlook, became the fabric of their new life together. The house itself seemed to soften, as if the air had shifted, letting in light and warmth. Even the old hound, usually wary of strangers, crept close to the fire, lying with his head on his paws, a silent sentinel to the unfolding story. June sometimes reached out to stroke his fur, offering the same gentleness she gave the bobcat. Samuel watched, heart full, as trust expanded to fill every corner of their home. On the third day, the bobcat managed to stand. It wobbled at first, testing its injured leg, then managed a few uncertain steps before collapsing in a patch of sunlight. June cheered softly, clapping her hands without a word, her face breaking into a smile so bright Samuel nearly wept. He realized he hadn't seen her smile, truly smile, in years. The joy was contagious. Even Samuel found himself laughing, a rough, rusty sound that made June turn to him, eyes shining. It was in those moments, watching his daughter light up with hope, seeing the wild animal respond to her care, that Samuel understood the true lesson. Love and trust didn't need to be loud or obvious. They didn't always come wrapped in conversation or celebration. Sometimes they grew quietly, in shared silence, in the willingness to wait, in small acts of kindness repeated again and again. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills and cast long shadows across the fields, Samuel sat by the fire, June's head resting against his arm. The bobcat slept nearby, breathing slow and easy. The old hound snored softly, feet twitching in dreams. The house was filled with peace, not because all their wounds had healed, but because they had chosen to heal together. Samuel realized then that the wildness in his daughter, the silence he had once feared, was not something to be fixed or conquered. It was something to be honored, accepted, and even cherished. By embracing June's way of being, her patience, her gentleness, her ability to connect with the wild, he was learning to heal, too. And so, as night fell and the fire burned low, Samuel whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. For the bobcat, for his daughter, for the strange, beautiful path that had brought them all together. For the first time in a long time, he believed that the future might hold more than loss. It might hold hope and love and the courage to begin again. The days after the storm blurred into a gentle, golden calm. The ranch seemed to breathe again, fields washed clean and sparkling under soft spring sun. Birds returned to their nests in the eaves. The old oak spread new leaves, tender and green, as if reminding everyone that life could begin again, even after the roughest winter. For June, the world outside the window held new magic. She woke early each morning, tending to the bobcat by the fire, feeding it scraps of chicken or bits of Samuel's cornbread, stroking its fur with a devotion that was both fierce and tender. The bobcat responded with sleepy purrs and, more often now, with bright, clear eyes that watched June with trust and understanding. Samuel saw the transformation in both his daughter and the wild animal. June, who once shrank from every touch, now moved with a quiet confidence, her small hands steady and strong. She had learned how to read the bobcat's moods, when it needed rest, when it wanted water, when pain flared in its leg and only stillness would do. Samuel, in turn, found himself following her lead, letting June's intuition guide him. The silent language between them grew into something almost sacred. But healing, Samuel knew, was not the same as forever. Each day, the bobcat's eyes wandered to the window, then the door, then the bright, beckoning world outside. Its leg, still stiff, was growing stronger. By the third morning, it was limping with determination, testing the boundaries of the living room and sometimes pausing to look out toward the open fields. June watched, her eyes shining with hope and something deeper, a bittersweet understanding, as if she knew a goodbye was coming. On the fourth morning, the house was quiet in that special way that always comes before change. Samuel rose early, making coffee and humming a half-remembered tune, savoring the warmth and light. June was already awake, kneeling beside the bobcat, stroking its fur. She looked up at her father, her face open and calm. "He wants to go," she said, voice soft but clear. Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He nodded, sitting beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder. "I know," he whispered. "He needs to." They opened the door together, the morning sun pouring in, spilling gold across the floor. The bobcat hesitated, nose twitching, then limped outside. June and Samuel followed, barefoot in the dew-wet grass, hearts heavy but full. The bobcat paused at the edge of the porch, then limped toward the fence line, head high, body tense with uncertainty but also longing. June watched every step, her hands fisted at her sides. When the bobcat reached the open field, it stopped, turning back one last time. For a moment, June thought it might return, might curl up by the fire forever, part of the family she and Samuel had built. But wildness calls to wildness, and some loves are too big for walls. June stepped forward, arm raised, not to reach, not to hold, but to wave goodbye. The bobcat held her gaze for a long, trembling moment. Then it dipped its head, a gesture of trust and thanks, and melted into the tall grass, vanishing as quietly as it had first appeared. The loss was sharp and sudden like a cold wind, but June did not cry. She stood tall in the morning light, her face solemn, her eyes brimming with something older than sorrow, acceptance, and maybe even peace. Samuel knelt beside her, pressing his palm to her back. "Are you sad?" he asked, voice gentle, uncertain. June nodded, silent tears shining on her cheeks. But then, for the first time, she smiled, softly, beautifully. The smile of someone who has learned that letting go is not the same as losing. It was a smile that told Samuel everything he needed to know, that his daughter's heart was strong enough to love and release, to grieve and grow. They stood on the porch together for a long time, watching the place where the wild grass rippled, where the bobcat had disappeared. Samuel felt the weight of his own lessons, the ones he had fought for and feared, the ones June had taught him without ever speaking a word. He thought of his wife, of the grief that had walled them in, and realized that love was never about holding on too tightly. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was open the door, trust in what you had built, and let the wild return to its own world. That afternoon, June seemed lighter, her silence gentle instead of heavy. She sat at the table drawing pictures of the bobcat, the oak tree, and the ranch. Samuel watched her, heart full, amazed by the changes in both their lives. He saw, too, the way June sometimes glanced toward the hills, her eyes bright with memory and hope. As evening fell and the sky blazed with colors, Samuel took June's hand and led her outside one last time. They stood together, quiet and still, as the wind brought the scent of wildflowers and earth. In the distance, just for a heartbeat, a bobcat silhouette appeared against the dying sun, pausing, looking back, a silent blessing from the wild. Samuel squeezed June's hand, feeling the truth in the quiet between them. The greatest connections may never need words. Letting go, he finally understood, was a kind of love all its own. And when June smiled up at him, her heart shining in her eyes, Samuel smiled back, knowing for the first time that healing had truly begun. Spring always came slow to the ranch, creeping in on a whisper, hinting itself in the color of new grass, the promise of blossoms on the old wild plum tree, the gentle return of robins and bluebirds to the fence posts. This spring, though, Samuel noticed everything with new eyes. Every sunrise felt like a blessing, every soft breeze a kind of grace. The world had turned, and with it, something inside his house, and inside his heart, had turned too. June was changing. It was there in the little things. The way she traced patterns in the soil of the garden, her hands caked with earth and seeds, the quiet hum that sometimes slipped past her lips as she worked. She drew pictures, dozens of them, filling page after page with bright sketches of the bobcat, the oak tree, the old hound, and herself. Sometimes Samuel found her on the porch at dawn, clutching her notebook, watching the distant hills where the wild lived and moved. Though June still spoke only rarely, her silence was no longer heavy or impenetrable. She gestured now, clear, confident movements, and sometimes took Samuel's hand as they walked, her touch warm and trusting. At times she would point at a cloud or a butterfly, or the line of geese flying north, and Samuel would find himself telling stories, letting his voice fill the quiet spaces. June didn't always answer, but she listened, her eyes shining, and that was enough. One morning, Samuel watched as June played in the garden. She knelt among the fresh green shoots, her dress streaked with mud, her hair loose and wild. The sun lit up her face, and Samuel's breath caught. He realized he was no longer waiting for her to become the child she once was. He loved her fiercely as she was now, a quiet, steady light, resilient and gentle, her own kind of wild. Sometimes neighbors stopped by the fence to say hello, dropping off eggs or sharing news from town. They would glance at June, still so silent, and ask careful questions. Samuel just smiled, no longer ashamed or anxious. "She's finding her way," he would say, and June, hearing him, would nod, sometimes even offering the smallest smile in reply. The ranch had become a place of new beginnings, not just for June, but for Samuel as well. And then, one bright afternoon, as Samuel weeded the far corner of the garden, he caught movement on the distant hill, a lean, graceful shape slipping through the grass. For a moment, his heart stopped. June saw it too. She stood, silent and still, shading her eyes with one hand. A bobcat, maybe her friend, maybe another wild soul, paused atop the rise, turning its head to look back toward the house. They watched together, breathless, as the bobcat held their gaze. June lifted her hand, not to wave, not to call, but simply to acknowledge, to greet the wild as an equal. The bobcat lingered, then, with one last lingering look, disappeared into the shimmer of the afternoon. There were no tears in June's eyes, only wonder, a gentle acceptance of the wildness that came and went, belonging to itself, touching their lives only for a time. Samuel knelt beside his daughter, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, and together they stayed there, quietly honoring the visitor and the journey that had brought them both here. That evening, as the sky turned gold and the first stars appeared, Samuel felt a deep peace settle over him. The losses they had suffered were still there, his wife's laughter echoing in empty rooms, the memories of darker days, but they no longer ruled his life. Instead, his days were filled with small, sacred joys. June's hand in his, her drawings on the table, the feeling of belonging, at last, to the world they'd made together. After dinner, June curled up beside Samuel on the porch, her head tucked beneath his arm. She watched the fireflies dance in the growing dark, drawing shapes in the air with her finger. Samuel found himself talking, not filling the silence but honoring it, telling June stories about her mother, about the history of the ranch, about the dreams he still carried in his heart. As night deepened, June stood and went inside, returning moments later with a piece of paper. She placed it on Samuel's lap, a drawing of a girl and a bobcat under the old oak tree, both gazing up at a sky full of stars. Beneath it, in careful letters, she had written just one word: "Thank you." Samuel's vision blurred as he read it. He looked at June, her eyes wide and solemn, and for the first time he found himself weeping, not from sadness, but from gratitude and awe. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close, letting all the pain and love and hope flow freely between them. The first spring after loss is always the hardest. But as the world bloomed and the wild returned, Samuel understood what his daughter had been teaching him all along, that not all love needs to be spoken, that healing is possible even after the deepest grief, and that sometimes the wildest hearts teach us the gentlest truths. And so, beneath the endless western sky, in the house made warm by presence and patience, Samuel and June lived on, rooted, hopeful, and forever changed by the quiet miracle that had touched their lives. If this story moved you, or if you've ever found connection beyond words, I'd love to hear your story in the comments or share this with someone who'd understand. Sometimes, the wildest moments are the ones that heal us the most.